Hey there, this is Tom with the Diogenes Lamp podcast. I appreciate you listening in, and most importantly, I hope you enjoy what you hear. Before we start with today's episode, I'm going to ask you for a small favor. Believe it or not, history podcasts, especially in their early stages, tend not to be cash cows. Shocker, I know. I too was blindsided by this news. Now, I didn't go into this for the money. I think that much is obvious. But unfortunately, books, research materials, and equipment aren't free. Please, go to patreon.com/Diogenes Lamp Podcast, and for less than the price of a coffee once a month, you can become a member and get access to bonus episodes, recommended reading lists and documentaries, shout-outs, and anything else we'll offer in the future as this project grows. If you are especially broke, hey, I get it, but please, make sure to give us a 5-star review when you listen to us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, and subscribe to the pod on your preferred podcast listening medium. Your support is appreciated, and more importantly, it is needed in order to keep this operation going. On that note, I hope you have a great day, and now back to the show. Hey everyone, today is Ohi Day, or in English as it translates to No Day, which of course refers to when Greek Prime Minister and Dictator Metaxas denied Italian requests of submission. We got Dale Pappas on the mic again, and today we're going to talk about the remembering and the forgetting of the big event itself, and of course of the events that led up to it. Long live Hellas, zito Helada, long live the Ohi, zito to Ohi, and may history never forget those who paid the ultimate price. Enjoy! So obviously, we know why Ohi Day is so important. That much I don't think needs much explaining. Do you think, and then this is kind of in the context of my podcast, I guess, so maybe not the most accurate to the masses, given I don't have millions of followers yet. But do you think the lead up to it is important and should be covered more and is sometimes not covered as much as it should be? And I mean the constant Italian provocations and, Mussolini and all that.
So you mean like all of these different steps, basically, is how do we get to that middle of the night meeting, basically?
Yeah, kind of like that. It's just, I've just always, in all these, I don't want to say whatever you want to call them, it's always not framed as, but it just appears that the Italians kind of appear out of nowhere, and I just don't think that's really accurate, and right. I think it leaves out a lot. I don't know, right? I don't know. You see the public stuff, right?
That's a great point. And that is actually, believe it or not, part of, I would say, the larger scholarship, in terms of different people studying different areas of this world and this time period. So you've got people who are more of the military experts on the Second World War, or on 20th century Greece specifically, or of course Italy, looking at Italian foreign policy, for example. And then also the people who work on, say, the Italian period of rule in Rhodes and the other islands of the Canessa. And so depending on who you're reading and who you're talking to, they might bring up some different things in relation to this. Not necessarily a dramatically different timeline. I'm not trying to say like, oh, we're talking, at each other, or just kind of missing big points. But there are some things that are emphasized to a different extent depending on where we're coming from this, which angle we're looking at this from.
Can you provide like an example? So, I mean, if I'm understanding correctly, the regionality you're saying, of the interpretation of the lead up and the ohi vary slightly.
To an extent, yeah. I mean, I would say probably one example, for instance, I think because we were talking a little bit about the Eli incident, for example. Typically, this is explored, of course, as one of the main parts of that run-up story, right? That is sort of the big event in that run-up to the 28th of October. Uh, what is not always discussed, not every historian necessarily emphasizes this or even kind of buys into the analysis here, but there are some people who emphasize the fact that one of the biggest proponents of that incident, the actual attack, and perhaps even was, according to some people, the decisive voice in actually trying to see it through, was the governor of the Italian Aegean Islands from Rhodes, De Vecchi, who happened to be one of the leading fascist figures in the party, one of the leading people in the regime. And so it has been said that he was one of the people who was an architect of this. And of course, he wanted to send a statement to, of course, the Greek nationalists in the area that he was controlling too, that, they wanted to emphasize that Italy was stronger than Greece, and that, you shouldn't challenge Italian rule if you're a Greek nationalist in Rhodes. So yeah, this is something that has been discussed, and of course, a lot of the Italian military stuff in that lead up to October 1940 essentially happens in that area. A lot of it is about the military buildup in Leros, which of course was the main Italian military installation in the Aegean, and also in Rhodes and to a lesser extent some of the other islands. So it is, in that sense, not surprising that the Italians were getting a little bit more aggressive and using those military installations as the place where they would be launching those kinds of aggressive acts, basically.
Interesting. I had not, never heard of that. That's so interesting. Pretty much to give a signal to the Greeks and the Dodecanese that, hey, we're here to stay, was what they wanted to project anyways. Of course, that didn't end up happening. And it's funny too, it is, you're right, that like the only thing that's really highlighted a lot is the Ellie incident, right? Like the whole thing with Dowd Hoxha, with, where they kind of like framed him or used him as a figure, as a martyr, overlooked. I mean, you can go way back. The Enrico Tellini incident. I mean, my God, what a false flag that was. And then there's another incident that we both talked about, Dr. Pappas and I had talked about, that is in John Carr's book, The Defense and Fall of Greece, and is also in Captain Corelli's Mandolin. But I've not been able to see anywhere else. Not to say it didn't occur, but
And I'll throw in one more example that is less something that was discussed in terms of the, say, political or foreign policy establishment. I don't recall the exact year, but it was sometime in the late 20s or early 30s. There was an earthquake that hit Albania really hard. It was before the Italians were really in control of Albania, so not so close to the start of the Second World War, a few years before that. And so there was a lot of international attention on this earthquake. It was particularly devastating to parts of Albania, and so there was a lot of international support in the form of the Red Cross, for example, too, going to help out in the humanitarian relief efforts there. And as that was happening, there was actually, according to the British vice consul of the time who was stationed in Corfu, I was reading a report of his to superiors, and the vice consul was saying that actually a lot of people on the island, so Corfu, say in Corfu town, were very nervous about the appearance of all these Red Cross people going to help the victims of this earthquake. They thought that they were Italians coming to invade, essentially.
Wow. It's almost like a hangover from the Tellini incident. I mean, that
Mhm.
was only 8 years earlier at that
Right.
point, right?
And it might have even been closer. Like I said, I'm not, I don't recall the exact year, sometime late 20s, early 30s. So it's well within very recent memory of all of that. And so it goes to show how nervous people were, especially there on the margins, there on the borders of Greece, and especially closer to Italy and areas of Italian influence. There was a lot of concern about what Italy might do.
Wow. Wow, wow, wow. It's yeah. I mean, Italy is a giant country, and although Greece is constantly looking east to Turkey, which is, I mean, today and traditionally far more hostile to Greece than Italy. At that time, Italy was also extremely hostile, and it kind of culminated in that in World War II, right?
And I think that's kind of going back to your point that you were saying a lot of this in the popular narrative just sort of seems to come out of nowhere. People don't really have a sense that were Italy and Greece somehow not on particularly friendly terms at this time. It seems rather unusual to people. And a lot of people, even, for example, even people who would know quite a bit about this time, point to, well, Italy and Greece had signed a treaty of friendship in the early 30s, and there was a sort of understanding that the Greek government was not going to push for any kind of nationalist agitation in Rhodes, for example. They had kind of come to an agreement with Italy there, if not in terms of a formal treaty, at least a sort of understanding. And so this could kind of read as a bit surprising to a lot of people that, wait a minute, that even if they know, say, the Ellie incident, right, that, wait a minute, this happens and there's this aggression, this sort of unprovoked aggression on a very symbolic holy day, and then only a few months later there's war. How does this happen, right? And so you definitely might have to take the story back a little bit to understand that Greece and Italy, even before the fascist regime was in power, even with what was called liberal Italy, the liberal democratic state that had emerged in the 1860s and 1870s, not too long after that state was created, Italy and Greece started to clash over certain territorial aspirations, not least of which being parts of Albania, as well as some other areas. So there was a long history of, even if they weren't going to necessarily go to war, there was a bit of tension there, and also some sort of warning shots, basically, that we're here to claim this region, or if something were to happen, this is our region. Italy is a greater power than Greece, and therefore it should basically have first dibs, essentially.
It's
Um,
interesting. I was just going to pivot as well to Northern Epiros, right? Because, and just for the listeners too, that incident we mentioned that's in Captain Corelli's Mandolin or a variation of it, and in John Carr's book, is there's like a false flag in Northern Epiros, I believe, in Corsi or somewhere like that, where a bomb goes off, and similar to what Hitler did in Poland, where he dressed up people in Polish uniforms and had them killed. It's something similar along those lines. But yeah, it is interesting, and I feel like it's overlooked as well. And I mean, I don't want to get too much into Greek-Italian relations, right? Because that's a whole other subject, which I know you know a lot about. But it is interesting too that it's overlooked too, the role, kind of like the spoiler role that Italy played in Northern Epiros. I feel like a lot, which from what I've read has been pretty significant. Quite significant in Greece not acquiring Northern Epiros. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of directions you could go in. I don't know. Is there anything you want to add on that, or
I think that's a good
yeah,
connection.
yeah? Because I mean, just from what I've read, Italy's traditionally been very. I mean, it's no secret. It uses Albania as a way to penetrate into the Balkans. Um, this has been known for a very long time, and it was especially true at that time, right? It's just it is interesting, and it's just a funny dynamic, especially here in the States. And this is in no way meant to be anti-Italian, but we are grown up with this una faccia, una razza type mentality that, oh, we're the same and we're very similar and this and that. But at the time, and I say this in the podcast, that was very much not,
Right.
that was not a
Absolutely.
thing. People were not
Absolutely.
on board for that. And, the Dodecanese Islands aside, we
Hmm.
can talk about the Italians' actions in the Asia Minor
Right.
campaign, which were hostile, very
Right.
hostile. I mean, this had been building up, and I think that's what made the victory at Ohide so much sweeter. This was such a huge payback. People think it was just a payback for Ellie. No, this was
Oh,
decades of payback to the Italians.
absolutely. Absolutely. This was not just about Mussolini and fascism, though we often now, and even, of course, a little bit at the time, really emphasize that point that this was about standing up to the fascist regime and to Mussolini. In particular, they were being really obnoxious and aggressive, and it was basically time for Greece to teach them a lesson. And of course, there's truth to that. That's not a total fabrication, but this was about much more, as you're saying. This is also not lost on people at the time that where do the Greeks go to achieve this victory? It's in Albania. It's in an area that they really, really wanted, and that they saw Italy as the country that was keeping them from that territory. Who else would stand in their way? Essentially, it was the Italians that had, and so you're right. The actual reaction to the success and to the dramatic success and the rapid success of the Greek military campaign against the Italians is largely seen in those terms. That this is a great victory to show that the Italians were beaten in this sense, that they can't tell Greece what to do, and they certainly can't dictate to Greece anything to do within its own territory. That how dare they try to come in and control the state itself. They can't even really dictate what happens outside of the borders of Greece and areas that they're fighting over at this point.
Is it and to my understanding as well, I mean another grievance, this is a long list of grievances that, came due on October 28th and through that year and whatnot in those months. But another grievance you could say, and correct me if I'm wrong, wasn't Italy supposed to re-deliver the Dodecanese Islands after they seized it after World War One? Or am I misunderstanding
Yes,
that correctly? They were supposed. It was almost supposed to be held as the fashion of you as you'd have something held in an escrow account, to my understanding. But they just held on to it after they just broke their promise and held on to the Dodecanese Islands.
it's essentially one of those situations with diplomacy when there's other events and other states that get involved in areas that earlier agreements are sort of just pushed aside, um, and that possession ends up becoming 9/10. The laws Italy saw it, and and that is one of the definitions of that. Really, that's like the textbook. One of the textbook examples is what Italy does in that time. So yeah, I mean, you can absolutely look at that in the same way that you look at essentially what happens with Greece at the end of World War One, pre the invasion of Anatolia, and of course the defeat and Lausanne, the sort of initial agreements. It's the same thing with the agreement with Italy, that Italy backs off on this once they realize, well, who's going to enforce this? Greece isn't strong enough to tell us what to do in this moment, and they don't even have their powerful friends, the British or French, or no one else is going to tell them. No one else going to tell us as the Italian government, some Italian official, you have to honor the terms of this agreement that you're making. It's just kind of an informal thing at that point that they could cast aside. And of course, they would basically run from that, because it wasn't like Italy, even after World War II, was like, well, we did say we were going to hand these islands over. Sorry about that. No, they fought tooth and nail to keep those islands, even,
Get out of here.
yeah, diplomatically. So there was a kind of 11th hour push, in 46 to basically say, hey, the British are there temporarily. Maybe they should give the island back to Italy, or at least try to come up with some kind of concession for roads, or to take a kind of portion of the economy, for instance, just based on the argument of, hey, we built this stuff. We built this stuff and we didn't get to cash in. So, Greece is going to cash in on this now. We don't get it. But countries were saying, well, this is sort of, first of all, we're on the enemy side first.
Right. First
So
things first.
you're
This is
gonna
how it goes.
you are going to
Yeah.
be punished for that. You're going to lose your colonies. And so
Right.
they said, well, we're okay with basically losing the African colonies because they had basically been to them at that point. But since they didn't really lose control of Rhodes until a little later, too, and the other islands, there was that sense. So it's yet another chapter of where the Greek-Italian relationship is a little testy, even sort of right at the end of that conflict. So that sort of lingers.
Something else I wanted to cover too, which I think really added to like the compounding of the sweetness of the victory, was what Greece had endured and suffered as a nation before leading up to this victory. Um, Again, something I think is super overlooked. Like it's always focuses David versus Goliath, and they were small versus big, but it's also like, yeah, but this tiny country had been through a crazy amount of stuff in the last 2, 3 decades, right?
It's true in the popular conception, especially say in the diaspora communities around the world. This is true that there is an acknowledgement of the plight of the refugees, but that indeed is kept kind of separate, for example, and not just, of course, the plight of the refugees, which is sort of publicly commemorated, of course, in different ways in diaspora communities, but also just the fact that there is sort of a lack or this kind of empty space in that narrative, in the popular narrative, between that moment, the early 20s, and how does Greece handle the refugee crisis, to then 1940. We kind of jump there. But they're not
Another
even
gap. Yeah, it's true.
right. But I mean, I think also, yes, there's the gap, but I think you're right too. I think what you're saying is absolutely correct, that not only is there a gap, but then those two things are not tied together, even though historians know they are. Uh, this is widely known in the sort of historical scholarship on Greece. Absolutely, the Anatolian campaigns, and then the subsequent refugee crisis, and the political and social crises, and the economic fallout from that time is widely known to be connected then to the Second World War experience. They're not really clearly separated, but in the popular memory, you're absolutely right. It is just not mentioned at all, really. Uh,
Like if you were
and
to mention to the, just see like you were saying, to the common diaspora Greek, in the lead up to this, there had been over a dozen coups. I mean, there had even been a coup technically in 1938 in Crete during the Metaxas regime. It failed, but technically speaking, there was an uprising, you know, and it's just very overlooked. And it's not like it's a small thing either, similar to the laundry list of grievances against the Italians. These are significant events.
I agree, and I think what you are saying is sort of a division or a dividing point between the Greek experience and the diasporic experience. I think that part of that is just because a lot of Greek Americans or Greek Australians or Greek Germans, Greek South Africans, wherever we're talking about, everybody's story is different. Everyone's family story, of course, is different. Yes, most people arrive in those places, or their ancestors came to that other part of the world, usually in certain waves that are a result of some of these big watershed moments, of course. But that doesn't automatically mean and I think this is what you're saying, that that doesn't really necessarily register with people, that these different historical events are really linked they know of these things like anybody knows their national holidays or their sort of ethnic or roots, their sort of traditions or national days of that other country. But they don't necessarily recognize the link between these things, which I think is what we're getting at here.
Yeah, for sure, absolutely. Let's move on a bit more towards the big day, of course. And let's talk about this is not I don't want to call it a pet peeve, but I think it really does go back to, the diaspora and whatnot and what really happened. And specifically, I want to zoom in on the conversation. I just think it's interesting that it is regurgitated simply as, and it is regurgitated. I understand why. Okay, do not get me wrong. I understand why people say it's just an ohi, just a no. But I feel like it is also overlooked a bit that there was a bit of a conversation, right? I'm not saying it was a huge one, even more so than from, depending on the source, if you're reading like PJ Vatikiotis or, other people or this or that or whatever, even more than, how do you say it in French? Alors c'est la guerre.
Yeah, yeah,
Even a little more than that,
right, right.
But it's interesting. Let me say this much and then I want to hear what you have to say as a doctor in this field. I do think it's interesting, and I think Metaxas would be very happy from the grave that it has been reinterpreted and reimagined strictly as ohi. This is what I said in my podcast. I'll say it to you, and I want to hear your honest take as an expert. Because, we look at the nature of the 4th of August regime, right? Which was, of course, make Greece great again, you could say. Minus, I don't want to draw parallels from that. But, it was an authoritarian, conservative government, okay? Fair enough. That we want to bring it back to ancient Greece, specifically Spartan Laconic ancient Greece, not Athenian democracy, parliamentarism, as we know. Metaxas hated parliamentarism. He quoted his Bible, or not his Bible, oh my gosh, his diary at one point. I can't wait to drink the blood of some parliamentarians, something like that, right? Guy hated parliament, politics, thought it was the devil, right? But do you think that Metaxas would be very satisfied that his propaganda machine, or however it was reinterpreted as, put it as ohi, which mimics the Laconian, brief, witty, molon lave, we'll fight in the shade, right? Versus Athenian dramatic prose and drawn out speeches and stuff like that. I find it kind of funny that the diaspora, there are people that literally think that he just said ohi. I just find it so funny because I just think it's so on point for the 4th of August regime of what they would have wanted, right?
There are Greeks that believe that too.
That's awesome. Oh my gosh.
It has become ingrained in the national memory as such. And you're right. I mean, what this does then, interestingly, is that it basically takes that moment, and of course we know it creates the day of the national holiday, this patriotic secular holiday, which in and of itself is a rarity in the Greek calendar. We don't have a lot of days that are secular. Even Independence Day is technically a religious holiday. And so there is a little bit of a parallel there with that event too, that those are two examples of what historians call an invented tradition, right? That these are things that are based in truth, things that obviously have happened to some extent. The Metaxa example of the conversation with the Italian ambassador and dealing with the ultimatum, we know for a fact has happened. There's plenty of accounts, and like you're saying, that talk more or less to the exact conversation that was had, but we know that they met there, and we know what happened, and we also know how it's then been distilled and how it's been shared with people to kind of boil it down to that one word and just kind of create this whole celebration, this whole day around that. These kinds of traditions are what countries' patriotism and sort of national identities are all built on. There's a bunch of examples of these. Every country has them. We have them in the United States. The British have them. The French, Bastille Day is a little bit like that too. There's been changes in the way that holiday has been recognized and celebrated, and sort of the nitty gritty of the events behind it. So everybody's got these traditions. I think what is interesting and a little bit more unique about October 28th is just how consistent that day has been as far as a celebration and as far as this belief in what was actually happening then. So that is a super successful invented tradition. I mean, we could talk too about March 25th in a similar way that we just kind of, I mean, popular understanding of that too just kind of takes wholesale this event. Now that event, of course, is dramatized. It didn't really happen as it has been popularly remembered, but the gist was there, and so that also shows just that kind of success of how these different kinds of stories just what latches on. But what is interesting about the 28th of October compared to a lot of other holidays is just how much that from basically the onset that was just accepted and everybody went with it, and it's been a holiday literally ever since.
Right.
uh,
Ohi,
in,
ohi, ohi. No, no, no.
in Greece and Cyprus, it has been a holiday from the onset, and has generally been understood, in terms of the events that occurred and the way in which it's been celebrated, has not really changed that much. It's been a pretty consistent thing, and that's rare for things generally change, right? I mean, in history, a lot of stuff is continuity and change. In history, there's generally usually a lot more change. Now, who knows? Of course, we're talking right now. It's going to be the 80th
The 85th, I
or the
think.
85th, yeah,
Yeah.
85th anniversary. We're just getting to the 80th, or we just had the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. So that's not a very long time in historical terms, and we can recognize this, right? Because we know we still see interviews with people who are old enough to remember some of these things. We don't necessarily still have people who were direct participants a lot of the times in these historical events, but plenty of people who are alive and are still giving interviews about their recollections of these kinds of events. So who's to say what things will be like decades from now? But it is rather interesting that there's been this kind of consistent celebration of that day.
Super. Big, absolutely. And it's just, I'll even read this little excerpt. So this is from, that book, The Last Ottomans, right? So this is from that book, and the excerpt is specifically from a news, like an article that was published in the page. This is from Thrakia. Super interesting. So this newspaper was actually a publication of the Muslim minority of Greece up in Thrace at the time, and this was published in December 1946. Or no, I'm sorry, October 28th of 1946. Blah, blah, blah. All around the world, people remember October 28th, the day where a mighty nation of 8 million spears submitted in front of a small nation. The night of October 28th, the Greek prime minister, in full confidence of the Greek people's patriotism and unity, said no. Greece would relive Thermopylae and Miltiades' invitation to the Persians for battle. So, that's not that far after, and it's just, and I mean, and I do understand, for mass consumption, what are you going to say? Well, there was actually a conversation. That's not exactly what I was getting at, but I just think that the parallel between the laconic nature that the Fourth of August regime was aiming at and wanted to instill and whatnot, and, that brief, witty, we will fight in the shade. I just think the parallel is very fitting, and I think Metaxas would be very satisfied.
And I think too, what you're also hinting at too, right, where he would also have to be very satisfied is, I'm sure he would have understood he would have been a controversial figure, that
Yeah, that's a good point. He was no dummy.
his legacy would be obviously poured over just like any other leader, and in his case maybe more than most in Greece. And so I think he would have to be rather pleased that something that he was directly associated with became so universally popular, not just in the moment, but also just going forward. It's a
Right. He had
rather
that.
it's a
He had
rather
that to going for him.
rather unique story that someone who was so controversial remains controversial from the historical record standpoint, but was controversial, of course, in his day as well, and not particularly well liked popularly.
Yeah, that's what I've read at the time. It's not like he was especially loved at the time. It was more just tolerated.
Very few people knew much of him in terms of the public. He was not a particularly public figure until he was in power, and even then, it's kind of an odd
There was no
relationship with
Venizelos
right. Not someone
in
who's
that
going to seek
respect.
right, not going to seek out the public attention and give these big speeches that people would quote or would want to read or go to see. And so I think that in that sense too, a rather successful historical record to leave as far as a very controversial figure is concerned. That you could have this like big moment and be basically popular for it.
Right, have
When,
that survive you instead of you yourself, right? Have the event that you created, and I guess that leads. Is there anything else you want to add, or I was going to pivot to something else?
I mean, I would just say, along with that, right, it's not that surprising given one, the event itself, the success of the event, right, that would endure, but also the fact that in terms of how certain people are remembered in Greece too, this isn't unique. There's also a similar kind of relationship with the junta, for example. They're not nearly as sort of a mixed bag record as Metaxas in terms of whether you've got people who say good things or people who say bad things, but there is still sympathy for the junta in Greece. And so even if it's not so full throated, uh, that might surprise people that, well, wait a minute, if we celebrate the restoration of democracy and the birth of this new constitution in the 70s and the successful two-party system that endures in Greece, how do we square that with being okay with the military dictatorship? Isn't do those things just not go together?
Good
Um,
point.
and,
Yeah,
and, and
absolutely.
so, Metaxa is also in that category of what does he do? Greece, believe it or not, as some historians have pointed out, interwar Greece, even with all of the chaos that we recognize, had by European standards of the day, a rather robust democratic, kind of liberal democratic system and a parliamentary system that was for the most part legitimate in ways that a lot of states just didn't really have the same kind of tradition at that point. And in terms of like suffrage, people's right to vote and who was allowed to vote and the regularity in which elections were held and uh, Greece actually had a fairly robust system, and that's saying a lot given the fact that we know, and we were just talking about how chaotic and these coup and counter coup attempts and all kinds of rigged plebiscites for the monarchy. And um, even with that, even with that, we have to also think about the time, 1920s, 1930s, and sort of history in Europe up to that point of states that have this kind of representative state, this kind of representative government. Greece actually had one of the more robust traditions until Metaxas. So that's also sort of difficult to square those things. So maybe then if we're talking here like we are about sort of public or popular memory, right, or popular understandings of this could get a little confusing for
Yeah,
that
well, that's what I
reason.
was just going to use that to pivot to, as you know, right? I mean, the legacy of Metaxas. I was just watching. I sent you a text earlier about the Washington Orchidea Foundation, which does a lot of good stuff, I think, for Hellenism in America, generally speaking. But it is interesting. There's a very famous historian on the Orchidea. I don't want to say any names, but he's very famous. And I don't know if he was put up to say this or he just said, whatever, I'll just say it just because. But it says Greece was fighting for freedom and democracy. I didn't know exactly what to say to that, given that, you know what I mean? And perhaps, listen, maybe those two things aren't as mutually exclusive as we think in that respect. Because at the end of the day, the people are the ones that did the fighting. And they say, oh, we may be under authoritarian dictatorship right now, but we'll be damned if we'll have another authoritarian dictatorship take us over as well. Well, let's beat this one first, then we'll fix our own one at home. And that's very possible. So, I mean, I don't want to say that those two things are, it's complete, kind of a bullshit thing to say. But, I mean, that, again, goes back to the legacy of what was going on in Greece at the time, which, as we know, was, there were book burnings in Greece leading up to World War II, right? This was very much, perhaps it was by no means as rabidly racist or anti-Semitic or genocidal as anywhere nearly as close as Italy or Germany, which, Italy had Spazio Vitali, Germany had the Lebaron Somme. So this was not even an expansionist or an aggressive, and again, you could even go further on that and say that, and I think this is fair, is that, Metaxas essentially, if anything, had euthanized parliamentarism at that point. We are talking about, the coups in 33, 34, 33, 35, 30, oh my gosh, look at all these. It's confusing, but, the two Republican ones that failed, then Condoleezza's coup that brought back the king, rigged plebiscite, as you had mentioned, and then, Metaxas' self-coup, right? At that point, it's fair to say, not to mention the coups that had happened between, 22 and on, that democracy's failed, guys, And, and that comes from someone who already hated, democracy and parliamentarism. I don't want to get too much down that because, the current events happening in America today, which do not parallel anything, I don't think. I was just going to say, have no relation at all to Greece. And I'm not being sarcastic. I'm saying that, America has not experienced any of the political instability or the bankruptcy that Greece experienced in 1930, which makes, the current events happening in America all the more weird and just strange and out of left field, but whatever. Sorry if I rambled there.
I think what you're saying, though, is important as far as this idea about democracy and what Greece was fighting for. You, I think, hit on exactly the point that the success of the 28th of October in terms of driving people to support the state and to resist the Italian invasion was the fact that it brought so many different people together, people who had been erstwhile enemies for the time, that they were no fans of this government per se, but people were able to come together in this moment and say, we have a bigger enemy here. Everyone can agree that things would be really bad if we became like an Italian satellite state. No one gains really here. No one really stands to gain anything. So everyone should do their part to resist this.
Even the
And
communists, sorry to interrupt you, but even
no,
the communists, you
right.
have Zachariadis' famous letter controversy. The first letter, there's debate as to whether he didn't get the Comintern directive or not, or whatever the case. There's a lot of debate. But the first letter is calling for communists to resist as well, while they're in jail, while they're being actively tortured and interrogated, right? That's
It's,
pretty amazing.
it is a moment where very clearly people responded together. And this is something that the Italians, one of the many things in terms of the lead up to this event, that the Italians never counted on. They never really thought that there would be this kind of resistance. Not only did they not think very highly of the Greek military, and based on the intelligence that they had, which was bad intelligence and often deliberately fed to them, misleading intelligence that was fed to them. They had nothing to fear as far as they were concerned, and they didn't think that there would be much resistance on the part of the population anyway. I'm not sure to the extent to which they thought that that would be the case just because they thought very little of what kind of popular resistance might be, or if they thought because of the fact that there was so much instability in Greece in those years leading up that of course people wouldn't band together and fight them. They would probably be able to get someone on side. And of course that's what they had been trying to do across the region, not just in Albania like we were talking about, but They had, of course, a very firm client state set up in Croatia. They worked with the Ustasha there. They had cultivated that relationship. And of course, then once the war starts, the Germans also uh, build up that relationship with Pavlich, the Croatian dictator. And so the Italians thought that there would be a Greek equivalent, essentially. Why wouldn't there be? They were trying to increase their friendly terms with the Bulgarians too. That really didn't go anywhere, and that was kind of difficult for them, considering the Tsarina, the wife of the Tsar of Bulgaria, was an Italian princess. So that was a little embarrassing to the Italian government that the Bulgarians were not really buying what the Italians were selling them on when it came to their plans for Greece, knowing that, hey, Bulgaria is a big enemy of Greece, arguably Greece's most consistent enemy in that moment. Why wouldn't they help Italy and basically carve up the Balkans between them? So there are a lot of these things, a lot of these different what ifs or uh, sort of misconceptions that have been guiding them, not least of which, like we were saying, this Greek resistance question. Would they find any resistance? And if so, would it be very easy to just mop up with so superior numbers? And as far as the Italians were concerned too, still with an element of surprise, which we knew was not true.
That's funny, yeah. That's it is interesting what you're saying in regards of to the surprise. I mean, interesting isn't the word. It's kind of comical, right? I mean, that they believe they were going to act on a surprise, but they were really being fed lots of fake information. We talked about this in the podcast as well. They were literally under the impression that entire colonels were going to surrender their regiments and divisions, and they're just going to kick in the door and the whole house would fall down and whatnot.
And that's also why Metaxas was surprised to see the ambassador on that night, but only because he thought he was going to see the French
Right. A lot of
ambassador
people
come.
don't talk about that either, right? That, because it was 3 in the morning, the guard had confused the tricolor and
Right.
whatnot.
So he knew that something was up with Italy. I mean, it's in his diary, for example, too, that they had looked for a couple of days prior that there might be some sort of, if not a full-scale invasion coming, perhaps another type of Eli incident, some sort of incident
100%.
that would occur and become like the next crisis that maybe could lead to a war. So
Right.
they
Finally
were
bring it about.
they knew. Uh,
Yeah. There's, like you're saying in his diary, and, you know, uh, again, we mentioned this. I got to stop saying that, but we do mention it in the podcast episode. So go ahead and go back and listen to some of the episodes. But I believe it's on October 25th. He puts in his diary, no attack today. And then the 26th, he goes, no attack today either, right? So
mm,
he's leading up to it. They're expecting it at any moment, right? Just like you're saying.
and it is funny that the Italians are stunned that this had been the case. That wait a minute, they're not surprised. They're not particularly concerned about this moment here. Why wouldn't they be so shocked that or at least concerned too that, like you were saying, is something going on internally? Are there people selling out the government and working
Right? They
with the
just
Italians?
assumed that was the case. I guess, it's partly your brain on, fascism. I mean, at that point, you are talking about, however much you want to say about the Italian population, that a lot of them did not like Mussolini. I think there's some truth to that for sure. But, that kind of extended fascism does seep into the bureaucracy and the framework of institutions like the military and spy agencies and stuff like that. And it causes a lot of inefficiencies, right? And one of those inefficiencies was, a lot of those inefficiencies came to the surface on October 28th, right? And, I'm sure, again, fascism, some racism played into that, and, you know, whatever you want to call it, cultural and racial supremacy, that we are the Romans and we're going to crush them just like we did 2,000 years ago, yada, yada, yada. So, no, it's funny. And Mussolini too. I mean, what a leader, right?
And just also, I mean, you're absolutely right. It's, of course, very well known. bureaucratic sort of infighting in the regime, which happens, of course. I mean, there's this very similar story in Germany too, that people also, of course, because they want to improve their lot or keep their position of authority or
Right.
closeness to the leader, to not
They
upset
lie.
the leader, or to say some things that maybe aren't so
Yeah.
true in the moment that get you some favor. And
Right on, boss. We got it. Don't worry. Yeah. Like, are you talking about and of course, I mean, I think the famous thing is the famous, not conflict, but what you're talking about is like can be between Praska and Badoglio. Badoglio kept kind of alluding to the fact that this is not as simple as you guys are saying. I mean, they went through like 3 or 4 generals. I mean, I forgot, but 3 or 4 generals they went through within the first 3 or 4 months of.
and just the messaging back and forth from the foreign ministry, for example, in Rome, and to people on the ground, or to some of their other officials who would be involved to some extent in the decision making. Just this sort of unwillingness to even acknowledge the reality that, oh, this is actually going to be pretty difficult. Oh no, he says it's not that difficult. To the other, like they're playing like phone, like just someone's talking and someone's getting this info. Oh no, yeah, it's not a problem. You'll be fine. Don't worry. Don't worry too much.
We'll break them
Uh,
now. They'll be broken now.
Right.
While
And I
they're
mean, we could get into so much. I mean, there's great books out there. I mean, the Hollow Legions, for example. I don't know if you've
Yes, I
mentioned
have it
that
on my
one.
shelf right here.
Okay.
I've only read bits and parts of it. Yeah, it's by Mario Cervi, right?
Mario Cervi's book
Yeah, yeah.
in Italian or English is a great account of that. Just the sort of comedy of errors, really. I mean, it would be very funny if it wasn't so tragic. That when you think about these are people's lives, the especially from the Italian military standpoint. I mean, they had so many troops who were basically just sacrificed for no reason.
Meat
And,
grinder type stuff. I mean, really just throwing into a meat grinder.
right, sacrificed for no reason, basically doing everything to achieve that result almost. I mean, it is really, really shocking that there could be so much oversight. I'll never forget some of those things that he talks about. That just anyone with any kind of understanding of how militaries operate would be stunned to learn
Right.
this
It's like,
was
are you
the
guys trying to lose? Are you
this
trying to lose?
this is what you're doing. Of course you're going to lose. That no matter who you're facing, even if there were pockets of people who were basically turning on their side over on the other side in Greece, it still would have been complicated because of how poorly organized and coordinated and led at that point that campaign was. So it just was not going to be easy.
Let me ask you one. We're going on an hour here, and so I just want to wrap it up. But let me ask you one question. It's I don't want to say it's a hot one, but so at the end of PJ Vatikios's book, Popular Autocracy, there's a bit where he the author had a conversation either with his wife or daughter or granddaughter. His granddaughter, of course, is Ioana Foca, who's still alive, and she shows up a lot on YouTube and stuff like that. Um, where PJ Vatikiotis PJ Vatikiotis, excuse me, asks her quite bluntly, do you believe that the state and society kind of gives enough credence or adulation or whatever you want to call it to Metaxas? And I believe the answer is she believes that they do not. I'm gonna have to reread it. Do you think that it is an appropriate level of recognition of Metaxa, or that there's not enough? Because there's some people that will say that he's not enough. Of course, there are people on the left that will say he's a fascist, and they'll allude to a lot of things, which understand. I
Right.
mean, there's definitely fascist overtones and whatnot within there. I don't know. What's your take on that?
Well, it's funny you ask that because it seems like everyone there isn't an easy answer from anyone's standpoint. I mean, you just brought up examples of people either saying he's very good or he's very bad because he's a fascist like this. I mean, I have read accounts of people who say he's a fascist, but he was kind of good.
Right.
So he's bad because he's a fascist,
He was
but he's
good
still
because he was
good for.
efficient. He was
So
competent.
right. So there are all different levels of. So I mean, again, we can get into so many different conversations about even whether he was. I personally don't like the label of fascist for him. I think it's too simple. Uh,
Agreed. Agreed.
and I don't say that just because it's my opinion about Metaxas personally. In fact, it's the opposite. I don't believe that because of Metaxas himself. I view that label itself as being something that has to be taken very seriously and dissected and meet a certain number of established criteria. In the scholarly sense, I mean, of course, like anything, people, of course, will love to say that academics, we come up with all different kinds of standards and whether or not we apply them or something like that. And fascism is one of those very tricky terms to meet the sort of threshold of whether or not it really, whether we can call something fascist or someone a fascist. And it's easy for us to say that all these people who are authoritarians or someone intrigued by authoritarianism even are fascist. Franco, for instance, I mean, Metaxas is pretty well known, even outside of the Greek story, as one of these people who is controversial as a dictator of that time. Is he a fascist? Is he not? But of course, Franco was the way bigger example of that time, and a lot of people are divided whether Franco is a fascist or not. I for a lot of the same reasons with as with Metaxa, I don't think that label is fully appropriate. I personally call them conservative paternalists, basically. That these are people who want to sort of take a country backward rather than build something new, which was a kind of prerequisite for fascism, as it was especially understood at the time. Fascists saw themselves as revolutionaries, and so, if your goal is to protect privilege and go back to the way things were rather than to sort of create something new, regardless of what that was, I don't know how that can be considered fascist in the same way. Uh,
Yeah, there's a lot of
and
other things I've read too. Sorry to cut you off,
yeah,
like the
yeah,
absence of a political party,
right.
right?
And so with
Lack of
and
rabid,
right.
racism that lacked. For the most part, there was some, but largely lacked. It didn't largely didn't have that as much as other places.
And just to kind of wrap up on that, I mean, this question to go back to what you were asking, whether or not Metaxa is sort of suitably recognized. I mean, I think he's recognized a little bit more than he would probably even be surprised for what we were saying, that he's popular for that moment and is not really known that much for any of the negative stuff. I mean, even in Greece, there's not a lot of talk about the more negative
Yeah, like the
elements, and
book
even
burnings, or book burnings of ancient Greek stuff
we
too, like Plato's The
we
Republic.
we tend to sort of smooth that over, and this is again a bigger question, but it goes back to what I was hinting at earlier, I think too, that in Greece publicly there is a sort of unwillingness to really challenge too much of anyone from the military background either. We tend to kind of view the army and the military more broadly as this sort of bastion of the state, uh, and so therefore, even when we acknowledge that some things that people within the military did were not above board, we are not necessarily as harsh as maybe we could be. And that, of course, the junta is probably the best example, and maybe again the even more shocking thing to people, that again we celebrate the foundation of essentially the modern state that exists today as a result of their fall.
Right, as
Yeah,
of the fall result of the fall of authoritarianism.
right. And even though we have a public holiday that also commemorates the resistance to them in the 17th of November, uh, it's still really not like everybody's like, oh, the junta's so bad. And so that's why also I feel like it's hard for us to sort of sit in judgment in the same way Metoxa. Um,
Yeah.
uh,
And context, as you had said earlier, right? I mean, the 1920s, 30s, we talked out earlier about the lead up to what led to the 4th of August regime, which was, a kind of a failure of democracy and parliamentarism in Greece, bankruptcy in 1930, yada yada.
And so I think, just to kind of wrap up on that, the thing that I would say is, maybe the better way to look at that is the sort of more abstract, rather than this more direct approach of like, how do we judge Metaxas, or how do we judge the junta? This is maybe more of a larger political and social question in Greece that has never really been fully resolved, which is more ideological in nature, and the questions of left and right, and the legacy of the, say, historical left and right in the country, and sort of how that has changed over time, and the relationship between those groups of people. That is, of course, a big question that all of this sort of folds into, in some ways. So this is fitting for what you're looking at too, as far as like the legacy and memory of the Greek Civil War, as well. We can't really separate all these things. So just like we were saying earlier about how, if we're really trying to think seriously about something, we can't separate the experiences of, say, Anatolia and the refugee crisis from the result, from the events of the Second World War in Greece, and certainly other events too, like the Greek Civil War. The same is true here. That all of this is sort of very much connected, and it's hard for us to just sort of dive in on one point and say we're going to judge this good, bad, otherwise.
Right, right. It's not that simple by any means, as very few things are. Well, I really appreciate you coming out today. It was a great talk, and I'm sure we'll have you back on again. And I think that we've left the listeners too with a lot of serious questions and serious conversations to have with themselves and whatnot, and with others. So thank you so much, and happy Orchidee.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Take care. Take care.
Θα σκοτωθώ, Τζιάνο, γιατί σε λίγο και τα τύρανα τα χάνω.